Welcome to NightWard Echo. Tonight we open the doors to 10 disturbing true California cabin horror stories, a place where the forest hides more than just shadows, and every creaking floorboard carries a memory you were never meant to hear. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it there right now? Don't forget to subscribe, because once you hear the echoes from these cabins, there's no turning back. I never believed the stories about Mount Shasta. You know, the ones, UFOs, hidden civilizations, strange lights in the sky. I always thought they were campfire tales to keep hikers entertained. But what happened to me last October changed the way I think about places that feel older than us. I'm a pretty experienced solo hiker. I'd been saving up for a week-long trip into the Shasta Trinity Wilderness. I wanted quiet trails, autumn leaves, and the kind of solitude you can't find in the city. I booked a cabin I found on a small vacation rental site. It was dirt cheap, and the pictures showed a rustic little place tucked into the woods at the base of the mountain. The ad was simple: secluded cabin, no neighbors, perfect for hikers, $45 a night. I thought I'd lucked out. I arrived just before dusk. The road to the cabin was narrow and choked with pine needles, the kind of one-lane dirt road that makes you slow down and lean forward over the steering wheel. The trees pressed in on either side like they wanted to keep me out. When I finally reached the clearing, I saw the cabin, a squat one-room structure with a sagging porch and a metal chimney. The wooden boards were weathered to a silvery gray. The windows were so dusty I could barely see through them. Still, it looked solid enough. There was a heavy wooden door with a brass latch. I didn't think much of it at the time. Inside, it smelled faintly of damp earth and old wood smoke. The furniture was sparse: a small table, a single chair, a narrow bed, and a cast-iron stove in the corner. There was no electricity, just a couple of lanterns and a bundle of candles on the shelf. I unpacked, lit a lantern, and sat on the porch to watch the last of the light drain from the sky. The woods around the clearing went very still. That was the first thing that struck me, how silent everything was. Even as the night settled in, I didn't hear so much as a cricket. Around 9 p.m., I decided to turn in. I shut the cabin door, latched it, and crawled into the bed. The night outside felt heavier than usual, like the darkness itself had weight. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a soft clinking sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling a loose shutter, but as I lay there holding my breath, I realized it was coming from the door. It was a faint metallic sound, like someone fiddling with the latch. I froze. My pulse was thudding in my ears. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I waited, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been the wood settling or the latch shifting with the cold night air. I drifted back to sleep. In the morning, when I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The door had a second latch on the outside, a heavy iron hasp I hadn't noticed before. I gave it a tug. It moved easily, like it had been unlatched recently. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was just part of the cabin's original design, meant to keep the door shut against bears or something. Still, the sight of it unsettled me. I shook it off and went hiking. The next 2 days passed uneventfully. I explored a few trails, climbed to a ridge overlooking the forest, and cooked simple meals over the stove. But every night, as soon as the last traces of daylight faded, that strange silence crept back. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it felt like the woods were holding their breath. On the third night, I was woken again by that metallic clinking. This time I stayed completely still, my eyes wide open in the dark. Then I heard it, the soft scrape of metal sliding into place. I crept out of bed, my bare feet silent on the creaky floorboards. I reached the door and pressed my ear against it. On the other side, something shifted. Not footsteps, more like a slow, deliberate movement, then nothing. I reached for the latch on my side of the door and froze. The iron bar was resting loosely in its cradle, but when I gave the door a gentle push, it didn't budge. Someone or something had latched the outer hasp. I can't describe the feeling of standing there in that small cabin, realizing I was locked in from the outside. My first thought was that it was a prank, maybe some local kid messing with tourists, but the nearest neighbor was miles away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat at the table with my lantern burning low, staring at the door, listening for the slightest sound. As soon as the first pale light of dawn seeped through the window, I rushed to the door. The outer hasp was open again. I stepped outside, my breath puffing in the chilly air, and scanned the tree line. The clearing was empty. No footprints in the damp earth except for my own. That day I debated packing up and leaving. But I'd driven so far and I didn't want to admit that I was spooked by some unexplained noise. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. That night was colder. I lit the stove and kept a lantern burning by the bed. I tried to stay awake, but sometime after midnight I must have drifted off. I woke to the sound of breathing. It was faint, slow, steady, and coming from just outside the cabin wall. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. For a long minute there was only silence. Then I heard it again, closer this time, just outside the window. I turned my head, trying to see into the dark glass, but all I caught was my own reflection in the lantern glow. I didn't move for the rest of the night. At dawn, I stepped outside, clutching the lantern like a weapon. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I circled the cabin slowly, scanning the ground. On the side beneath the window, I saw them, 2 footprints, bare human. The prints were clear in the damp soil. The toes pointed toward the cabin wall. That was enough for me. I packed my gear in a rush and shoved everything into the trunk of my car. Before I left, I went back to the cabin one last time to check the door. The outer hasp hung loose, swinging gently in the morning breeze. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported what had happened. The ranger, an older man with a weathered face, listened quietly. When I finished, he frowned and said, "You stayed in the old Mercer place, didn't you?" I told him I thought that was the name on the listing. He shook his head slowly. "We've had reports like yours before. Folks say they hear things at night. Sometimes they find the door latched from the outside. We tell people not to rent that place anymore, but the owner keeps putting it back up online." I asked him what he thought was going on. He just shrugged. "Some things out here are best left alone." I haven't gone back to Mount Shasta since. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear that faint metallic clinking, the sound of the hasp sliding shut. If you ever plan to hike near Shasta and find a cheap little cabin for rent with a sagging porch and a brass latch on the door, don't stay there, because I'm pretty sure that whatever locked me in that night wasn't trying to keep itself out. It was trying to keep me in. I want to start by saying I've never been the type to believe in ghosts. I've always been the one to roll my eyes when friends share their haunted house stories. But what happened to me and my girlfriend Leah in the mountains last winter still makes my stomach twist whenever I think about it. I don't tell this story to convince anyone. I tell it because I need to get it out of my head. We booked a small log cabin for a weekend getaway in late December. It was one of those cozy Airbnb places tucked deep into the woods of Vermont. The photos showed a single-bedroom cabin with a fireplace, thick pine beams, and a loft above the bedroom that the listing described as unfinished and unused. It seemed perfect for a quiet weekend away from the city. The drive up was uneventful, though the sky was already bruised and heavy with snow by the time we arrived. The cabin was everything the listing promised. Warm wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a big window overlooking a frozen lake. The loft above the bedroom was just a shadowy opening in the ceiling, with a narrow wooden ladder leading up to it. There wasn't even a railing, just an open square cut into the floor of the loft. I remember joking with Leah that it looked like the sort of place where someone would crouch at night and stare down at us while we slept. She gave me a look and told me to shut up. The first night was peaceful. We ate dinner by the fire, listened to the wind pushing against the cabin, and eventually went to bed early. The bedroom had that snug, old cabin smell of wood and cold air. I slept like a rock, but around 3 in the morning I woke up. Not because of a sound, at least not at first. It was that strange, alert feeling you get when something in your surroundings isn't quite right. I lay there in the dark, listening. That's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I wasn't sure it was real. It came from above us, from the loft, a slow, drawn-out sound, like someone speaking just under their breath. I couldn't make out any words, just the soft cadence of a voice, then silence. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling. Leah was asleep beside me, breathing evenly. I told myself it was the wind seeping through the boards, or maybe a draft moving something up there. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I didn't mention it to Leah. I didn't want to freak her out. We spent the day hiking along the frozen trails by the lake, took pictures, laughed at how clumsy we were in the snow. By evening, we were tired but happy. That night, the whispers came back. I woke up again, this time to the soft rasp of two voices. They were speaking so quietly I could barely hear them over the thud of my heartbeat. It didn't sound like words in any language I knew, just murmuring, sometimes rising slightly in pitch like a question being asked and answered. I turned my head to look up at the loft. It was pitch black up there. The cabin didn't have a nightlight, and the only glow came from the dying embers in the fireplace through the open bedroom door. I could just make out the square opening of the loft above us. I swear I thought I saw something shift in the shadows, like someone leaning slightly forward, then pulling back. I almost woke Leah then. My hand even hovered over her shoulder, but I told myself I was overreacting. I lay there with my eyes fixed on that opening, until dawn's faint light seeped through the curtains. By then the whispers were gone. At breakfast, I finally told her. She looked up at the loft, frowning. "Probably the wind," she said, but I could tell she wasn't fully convinced. We both kept glancing up at the dark hole in the ceiling as we sipped our coffee. That afternoon, out of curiosity, I climbed the ladder to check the loft. The air up there was colder, carrying that musty smell of old wood that hadn't been touched in years. The loft itself was bare, just a wide plank floor with a few cobwebs in the corners. No furniture, no boxes, nothing. I knelt and tapped on the floorboards. Solid. I even checked for mouse droppings or signs of animals, but found none. It was as empty as it looked. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the cabin. I convinced myself that the previous nights had just been my imagination. I felt better for a while, until we went to bed. Around 2:30, the whispers began again. Louder this time, as though they were right above the bed. I froze listening. The voices sounded urgent now, their strange language rising and falling in soft bursts. Then as I strained to hear, I realized something that made my skin crawl. I could hear the faintest sound of movement. The floorboards above us creaked, just a little, as if someone was shifting their weight to keep balance. I nudged Leah awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She lay still for a second, then her eyes went wide. I could tell by her face that she heard it too. We lay there in silence, both staring at the ceiling. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The creaking stopped. The silence that followed was worse somehow, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Leah grabbed my arm. "We need to leave," she whispered. I nodded, but it was the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere, with snow coming down hard outside. I told her we'd pack up and go at first light. We didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Every time I felt myself start to drift, I'd hear that soft creak above us again, like someone shifting position to get a better view. The morning couldn't come fast enough. We packed in near silence and loaded the car. As we were pulling away down the snowy road, I looked back at the cabin. From the bedroom window just below the loft, I thought I saw the edge of a pale face retreat into the shadows. It might have been a trick of the light. I tell myself it was. We didn't report anything to the cabin owner. What would we even say? "There are voices in your empty loft?" It sounded ridiculous, but I haven't been able to shake that feeling, that something watched us the whole time we were there, crouched above our bed, whispering in a voice we were never meant to understand. Leah doesn't like to talk about it now. She says it was probably just the wind. I let her believe that because it's easier than admitting the truth. Every night since we left, I wake up around 3 in the morning, straining to hear whispers in the dark. I haven't heard them yet, but sometimes I think I catch a faint creak above the ceiling, and when that happens, I can't help but wonder if something from that cabin followed us home. I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. I grew up in the city, and when you live surrounded by traffic, neon lights, and the constant hum of life, it's easy to dismiss tales of haunted woods as campfire nonsense. But I swear to you, and I know how this sounds, something out there in the forest near Big Bear Lake is real. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants, but I've seen it. We all did, and I've been haunted by the memory ever since that night. It was early October, the first real cold snap of the season. My friends, Mark, his girlfriend Jamie, and my younger brother Caleb, had planned a weekend getaway to a rental cabin by Big Bear Lake. It was supposed to be simple, 2 nights away from the noise. No phones, no Wi-Fi, just a wood stove, fishing, and the kind of peace you only get in the mountains. I was the reluctant one in the group. I like nature in small doses, but I'm not a mountain cabin type. Still, I went along because Mark had been my best friend since high school, and Caleb had begged me to come. I told myself it would be fun, hot cocoa by the fire, maybe a hike or two, just a nice break. The cabin was an old, creaky A-frame tucked back from the lake's edge, surrounded by pines that crowded close like tall, black-needled sentinels. It smelled faintly of damp wood and old smoke. There was no cell service, which felt charming at first and then a little unsettling once the sun went down. That first night, we sat on the cabin's back porch wrapped in blankets, listening to the water lapping against the shore below. It was quiet and almost too quiet. The city has its own kind of constant soundtrack, but here, even the wind sounded like it was holding its breath. Around 10 o'clock, Caleb was the first to notice it. "Hey, do you guys see that?" he asked, pointing toward the tree line across the lake. At first I thought he was seeing things, but when I followed his finger I saw it too, a faint warm glow like a lantern bobbing between the trees. Too far to make out details, but definitely moving. Mark chuckled. "Probably just another camper, maybe some old guy with a fishing lantern." Jamie frowned. "Who goes wandering around the woods at night? There aren't even trails over there." We watched it for a while. The glow would drift between the trees, disappear behind a trunk, then reappear a little farther along the shoreline. It wasn't a flashlight, the light was steady, soft, golden, and it seemed deliberate. Like whoever carried it wasn't just wandering, but searching. I remember thinking it was strange, but not frightening. Not yet. Eventually, the glow faded out of sight and we went inside, chalking it up to someone night fishing. The next day was ordinary. We hiked a trail along the lake, cooked hot dogs over the fire pit, and played cards as the sun sank behind the pines. By dusk, a thin fog had rolled in off the water. That night, sitting again on the porch, we saw the lantern. Same warm glow, same strange, patient movement through the trees. Only this time it seemed closer. Caleb whispered, "He's on our side of the lake now." I felt a shiver crawl up my arms. It was true. The glow bobbed maybe 100 yards away, weaving slowly between the trunks. Whoever carried it wasn't using the lakeside trail. They were cutting through the woods closer to the cabins. Mark called out jokingly, "Hey, you lost out there?" No answer. The lantern paused, just stopped between two pines. The light swayed a little, like it was dangling from a hook or a hand that trembled ever so slightly. Then, after a long moment, it moved again, but not away. It took a few careful steps toward us. Then another. I don't know why, but the air on the porch seemed to thicken. Jamie grabbed Mark's arm. "That's creepy," she said in a low voice. Mark tried to laugh it off, but even he sounded uneasy. Probably some hiker heading back to his tent, relax. But none of us really relaxed. We stayed on the porch until the lantern's glow slipped behind the trees and vanished. I don't remember us going to bed that night so much as retreating indoors, locking the cabin door, and pretending everything was fine. It wasn't. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of crunching gravel outside. Not animal footsteps, and slower, heavier, human. I held my breath, listening. The others were asleep, their slow breathing filling the dark cabin. I crept to the window by the kitchen and eased the curtain aside. The porch light was off, but through the trees, halfway down the slope toward the water, I saw it again. That lantern, closer than before. I swear I could almost see the faint outline of a figure holding it. Tall, thin, standing unnaturally still. I couldn't make out a face or clothes, just a shape, and that soft golden light dangling from one hand. It was pointed toward the cabin. I let the curtain fall back and stood there in the dark, heart pounding so hard I felt dizzy. Part of me wanted to wake the others. Another part thought, what if I'm seeing things? What if it's just a trick of the fog and moonlight? I stayed frozen by the window for what felt like forever. When I finally looked again, the lantern was gone. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd dreamed it. I didn't tell the others, but Caleb brought it up at breakfast. "Did you guys hear footsteps last night?" he asked. "I swear I heard someone walking outside, like on the gravel path." Jamie shot him a look. "Don't say that. That's creepy." Mark shrugged, pretending not to care. "Probably just a deer." None of us believed that. We decided to cut our trip short and leave that evening. But by late afternoon, a heavy rain blew in. The single narrow road down the mountain flooded in places, and Mark wasn't comfortable driving in the dark on slick mountain roads. We agreed to stay one more night. I wish we hadn't. After sunset, the power flickered out. The storm had knocked out a line somewhere. We lit a couple of candles, tried to play cards by their flicker, but nobody was in the mood. Then through the steady patter of rain on the roof, we heard it, a distant splash. Like someone had waded into the lake. Jamie went pale. "Tell me that was a fish." We all moved to the window, peering out into the dark, rain-slicked trees and the silvery ripple of the lake. And there it was, the lantern, out on the water. It glowed faintly through the sheets of rain, bobbing on the surface like whoever held it was wading chest-deep in the lake, slowly making their way toward our side of the shore. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. No boat. No sound except the rain and the faint lap of water. We backed away from the window in silence. I don't know why none of us spoke. We just watched. The glow came closer to shore, then disappeared behind the line of pines. A minute later, we heard the crunch of gravel, slow, heavy. Coming up the path toward the cabin, Mark grabbed the fireplace poker and stood by the door. Jamie started to cry softly, pressing her hands over her mouth to stay quiet. Caleb stared at the door like he couldn't blink. The footsteps stopped just outside. For a long moment, nothing. No knocking, no voice. Just the hiss of rain and the distant gurgle of the lake. Then we saw it. The faintest trace of golden light leaking through the crack beneath the door. It moved, back and forth like someone pacing slowly across the porch. We stayed frozen, too terrified to speak until after what felt like hours. The light faded away. Eventually, exhaustion won. We dozed off in fits, sitting upright in the living room, the candles burning low. At first light, we packed in silence and left. The road was muddy but passable, and we didn't look back until we were halfway down the mountain. When I finally did glance over my shoulder at the lake, I thought I saw it again. That faint, steady lantern glow among the trees, standing still, as if watching us leave. That was 6 years ago. I haven't been back to Big Bear Lake every so often, though on certain cold, foggy nights, I'll be walking home from work in the city, and I'll think I see it again. A distant golden glow between the trees in the park. Too far to be sure, always still, always watching. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but I always walk a little faster, and I never, ever look back for long, because I can't shake the feeling that if I stare too long, I'll see that lantern start to move slowly, deliberately, closer. That's the story. Believe it or not, I know what I saw, and I can't help but think there's something out there by that lake, waiting with its lantern, patient as the woods themselves. I don't usually share stories online, but this one has been eating at me for over a year. I still can't explain what happened, and I'm hoping that maybe someone out there has experienced something similar. I was on a solo road trip through Northern California, looking to get away from the noise of my life for a few weeks. I wanted solitude, a chance to think, hike, and just be alone. What I got was something else. The cabin I rented was buried deep in the redwoods, about a half hour from the nearest town. It was the kind of place you see in glossy travel magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a sliding glass door that opened onto a small deck overlooking a slope thick with ferns and towering trees. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The place smelled of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that makes you feel like you're really off the grid. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, drank tea while listening to the wind in the trees, and went to bed early. There was no cell service, but I had downloaded some podcasts to keep me company. I fell asleep to the distant sound of the creek that ran somewhere behind the cabin. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I thought it was just the unfamiliar creaks of the cabin. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate tapping, like someone gently drumming their fingernails on glass. I lay there in the dark, frozen, listening. The sound was coming from the sliding glass door in the living room, the one that looked out onto the deck. I told myself it was probably a branch swaying in the wind, maybe hitting the glass. Still, I didn't get up. I pulled the covers tighter and tried to fall back asleep. After a few minutes, the tapping stopped. The next morning, I checked the door. There were no branches close enough to reach it. I stepped outside onto the deck, expecting to see some obvious culprit, maybe a loose railing or a bird that had pecked at the glass. Nothing. The woods felt heavy and damp. When I looked back at the cabin, the glass door reflected the trees behind me, dark and endless. The second night, the tapping came again. Same time, a little after midnight. Tap, tap, tap. Always in short bursts, always gentle but rhythmic. Like someone trying to get my attention without waking the whole house. I sat up in bed this time, straining my ears. The tapping stopped when I moved. I stared at the bedroom doorway for what felt like hours, waiting for it to return. It didn't. By morning, I started to feel a little silly. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe even the house settling. I went for a long hike that day, trying to shake off the unease. The forest was beautiful but strangely quiet. No distant hum of roads, no planes overhead. Just the crunch of my boots on the damp earth. I kept catching myself glancing back down the trail, as if expecting to see someone there. That night, I left a small lamp on in the living room. I thought maybe a little light would make me feel less jumpy. I also set my phone on the coffee table to record audio, thinking I'd catch the sound and prove to myself it was nothing. I fell asleep quickly, but woke again, like clockwork, around midnight. The cabin was utterly still. I listened hard, my heart already thudding. Then it started, tap, tap, tap. This time it was slower. 3 taps, then silence. Then 2, then 3 again. I slid quietly out of bed and crept toward the living room, keeping my feet on the rug to muffle my steps. The light from the lamp barely reached the sliding door, and beyond it the deck was a black void framed by the tall redwoods. I got as close as I dared, maybe 10 feet from the glass. I couldn't see anything outside, just the faint reflection of the lamp behind me. I stood there holding my breath. That's when the tapping started again, right at eye level. I nearly screamed. The sound was so close I swear I felt it in my chest. Tap, tap, tap. I couldn't move. I just stared at the glass, waiting for my eyes to adjust to see whoever or whatever was standing on the other side. But there was nothing. After what felt like forever, the tapping stopped. I backed away slowly, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I locked myself in the bedroom and stayed awake until dawn. In the morning, I checked the recording. It had picked up the sound and faint but definitely there. No wind, no rain, just soft tapping against the glass. I called the cabin's owner from a nearby town where I had cell service. I told him about the noise, hoping he'd say it was just raccoons or some other wildlife. He paused for a long time before answering. Then he said almost reluctantly, "Sometimes people think they hear things out there at night. The woods play tricks on you." That didn't sit right with me. He didn't sound dismissive. He sounded uneasy. I decided to leave that day. I packed up, locked the cabin, and drove back toward the highway. But as I was pulling out of the gravel driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, and I can't swear this wasn't my imagination, I thought I saw someone standing on the deck, just behind the sliding glass door, a tall, pale figure, motionless, watching me. I hit the gas and didn't look back. It's been over a year since that trip, and I still dream about the tapping. Sometimes I wake up convinced I've heard it on my bedroom window at home. I've moved apartments twice since then, but it doesn't matter. I'll be drifting off to sleep and then tap, tap, tap. I don't know what was out there in those woods, and I don't want to know. But if you ever find yourself alone in a cabin with a sliding glass door looking out onto the forest, do yourself a favor. Close the curtains at night. You never know who or what might be standing just on the other side. I've told this story only a few times, mostly to people I trust not to laugh it off. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain what happened. All I know is that every time I think about it, I get that same crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone is standing just behind me. It started as a simple hiking trip. My friends and I, there were 4 of us, me, my college roommate Matt, his girlfriend Kelly, and my younger cousin Daniel, decided to spend a long weekend in Sequoia National Park. We'd been talking about it for months, planning to camp deep in the forest where the trails thinned out and the crowds disappeared. We weren't new to hiking, but none of us were seasoned survivalists either. We figured we'd follow the marked trails, set up camp by a river, and enjoy the solitude. The first day was perfect. The sun filtered through the massive trees in golden shafts, and the forest smelled of pine and damp earth. We made camp near a creek and cooked instant noodles on a tiny camp stove. We talked and laughed late into the night under the huge, star-speckled sky. That night felt safe, the way the woods sometimes can when the moon is bright and your friends are close by. The second day, the weather changed. Dark clouds gathered by late afternoon and the temperature dropped. We'd planned to hike a loop that would bring us back to camp by dusk, but about halfway through the trail, a heavy rainstorm rolled in. The rain came in sheets, soaking us within minutes. The temperature plummeted further, and thunder boomed somewhere in the mountains. We weren't in immediate danger, but we needed shelter fast. We huddled under a dense cluster of redwoods, trying to decide whether to push back to camp or find somewhere nearby to wait out the storm. That's when Matt spotted something through the sheets of rain, a dark, angular shape about 50 yards off the trail. We thought at first it was a rock outcrop, but as we moved closer, we realized it was a building. A cabin. It stood in a small clearing among the trees, rough-hewn logs stacked with that old frontier style, a pitched roof glistening wet in the rain. There was no smoke rising from the chimney, no sign of life. The windows were dark and blank, but at that moment it looked like salvation. We hurried across the clearing, the rain slapping at our backs. The cabin's door wasn't locked. It groaned softly when Matt pushed it open. The smell that hit us was a mix of wet wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old coins. Inside, the air was surprisingly dry. There was a table and 2 chairs, a cold stone hearth, and a narrow staircase leading up to a loft. The place looked abandoned but not ruined. There was no debris, no cobwebs thick enough to suggest it had been left for decades, just empty. We shook out our jackets and set our backpacks near the wall. Kelly said the cabin felt wrong, but I figured it was just the storm making everything feel eerie. We built a small fire in the hearth with the wood stacked in a corner, surprisingly dry, as if it had been stored for use. The fire burned steadily, casting flickering light across the cabin's walls. For a while, we were just grateful to be out of the rain. But as the evening wore on, little things started to bother me. The first was the silence. Even with the storm raging outside, the cabin seemed to dampen sound in an unnatural way. I couldn't hear the rain drumming on the roof, only the soft hiss of the fire. The second was the smell. That faint metallic tang never went away. It clung to the air, sharp and unsettling. Daniel was the first to say it out loud. "There's something off about this place," and he muttered, sitting cross-legged near the fire. "Like, it doesn't want us here." We all laughed nervously, but I felt it too. The shadows in the corners seemed too deep, too still, and the firelight didn't reach far enough. I kept glancing at the dark rectangle of the window, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. At some point, Matt went up the stairs to check out the loft. He came back down quickly, pale and tight-lipped. When we asked what was up there, he said, "Nothing, just an empty room." But he wouldn't look us in the eye when he said it. We slept in shifts that night. I took the first watch, sitting by the fire while the others tried to rest. The silence was so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. At one point, I thought I heard soft footsteps pacing across the loft overhead, slow, deliberate steps. But when I strained to listen harder, they stopped. I didn't wake anyone. I told myself it was the cabin settling in the storm. When morning came, the rain had stopped. Sunlight streamed weakly through the windows, turning the cabin's interior into a harmless, dusty space. We packed up and left quickly, eager to get back to our camp. No one talked much as we hiked, as if we'd all silently agreed not to bring up the strange atmosphere of the night before. But here's where it gets weird. That afternoon, we retraced our route to make sure we hadn't left anything behind. The storm had passed and the trail was easier to follow. When we reached the point where we'd cut off the path to find the cabin, there was nothing, no clearing, no log structure among the trees, just dense forest, unbroken and undisturbed. We searched for nearly an hour, walking back and forth, convinced we must have missed it. But there was no sign the cabin had ever existed. Kelly suggested maybe we'd gotten turned around in the storm and stumbled into a ranger's outpost somewhere else in the park. But when we checked the maps later, there were no structures, not even old ones, anywhere near that trail. That night back at camp, we barely slept. Every snap of a twig in the dark made us all sit up. At one point, I thought I heard the same slow creak of footsteps outside the tent, moving just beyond the thin fabric wall. I held my breath until they faded, and I didn't tell the others. When we finally left the park the next morning, it felt like a weight had lifted off us. We didn't talk about the cabin on the drive home. It was as if speaking of it would make it real again. A week later, I got a text from Matt late at night. It said, "Did you hear it too? Upstairs?" That was all. I didn't respond right away. I didn't know what to say. Since then, I've had dreams about that place and the narrow stairs, the smell of metal in the air, the hush of the storm outside. In the dreams, I always look up toward the loft, but I never see what's up there. I always wake up before I do. I've tried to find records of cabins in that part of Sequoia. I've dug through old maps and park archives online. There are no reports of a building where we found it. Not even an old ranger hut. Nothing. I still hike sometimes, but I avoid that part of the forest. And whenever the rain starts to fall and the trees begin to blur behind the curtain of water, I get that crawling feeling on the back of my neck again, as if somewhere out there, in the shifting shadows of the storm, the cabin is waiting for us to find it again. I should start by saying I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts. I always figured there's a rational explanation for every creak in the night or chill in the air. But what happened to me last autumn in Yosemite changed the way I look at, well, everything. It began with a loose floorboard. I'd rented a small cabin deep in the woods near Yosemite for a long weekend. I'd been overworked and needed a break from city noise. The listing described the cabin as rustic but cozy, with no Wi-Fi, limited cell reception, and a wood-burning stove. That sounded perfect. The first night was peaceful enough. I lit a fire, read a book, and went to bed early. But the second evening, as I was throwing another log onto the stove, I heard an odd creaking sound behind me. At first, I thought it was just the old timber settling, but when I stepped closer, I realized the noise came from one of the floorboards near the foot of the bed. It wasn't just creaking. It shifted slightly when I put my weight on it. Curious, I crouched down and pried at the edge with the back of my pocket knife. After a bit of effort, the board came up, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook. The cover was cracked and dry. The color faded to a grayish brown. It looked like it had been hidden there for decades. At first, I thought I'd stumbled across an old guest's forgotten journal. Maybe something quaint or even funny. I carried it to the table by the window and opened it. The handwriting was cramped and shaky. The first page was dated October 1972. The opening lines read, "If anyone ever finds this, know that I tried to leave. But he's still out there, watching me. He waits until nightfall, then comes closer. I don't know how long I can hold out." I frowned, wondering if this was just some old campfire story someone had scribbled down for fun. But as I flipped through the pages, my stomach tightened. The entries described long, tense nights in this very cabin. The writer hearing footsteps on the porch, whispers near the window, and seeing a man standing just beyond the tree line. What unsettled me most was how specific it got. The diary mentioned the split log fence behind the cabin, the crooked pine that leans toward the roof, and even the tiny draft that comes up through the loose board at the foot of the bed. Set the diary down and walked over to the window. Sure enough, the split log fence was still there, barely holding together, and there was the crooked pine, bent slightly toward the cabin as if bowing. That's when I noticed something else. Just at the edge of the trees, where the forest thickened and shadows pooled, there was a shape. It was too far to make out clearly, but it looked like a person standing very still. I blinked, stepped closer to the glass. By the time I focused, the figure was gone. I told myself I was just spooking myself after reading the diary. I closed the curtains, stoked the fire, and decided to keep reading, hoping I'd find some rational explanation in the later pages. The entries continued over the course of several weeks. The writer, they never gave a name, described feeling watched during the day, too. They'd spot the figure near the fence, sometimes crouched behind a rock, sometimes halfway up the slope toward the ridge. One entry chilled me more than the rest. Last night, I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not mine, it came from under the floor. When I pressed my ear to the boards, it stopped. But I know he's there, waiting. I closed the book and sat in silence for a long time. The cabin creaked, the fire crackled, the wind hissed against the window. I told myself this had to be an old story, maybe even fiction, but I couldn't shake the image of the figure I'd thought I'd seen in the trees. That night I had trouble sleeping. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and every so often I'd hear what sounded like light footsteps on the porch. I tried to ignore it, burying myself in my sleeping bag, but around 2 a.m. something woke me. A soft thud. It came from the floorboards near the foot of the bed. I sat up, holding my breath. The cabin was dark except for the dying embers in the stove. For a long moment I heard nothing. Then, just as I was about to lie back down, there came another faint sound. A slow, deliberate scrape against the wood beneath me. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to move. The next morning, sunlight flooded the cabin and I felt ridiculous. I checked under the bed, in the closet, even outside on the porch. Nothing. Just the forest and the chill morning air. I decided to leave the diary alone for the rest of the day, hoping a hike might clear my head. The trails were quiet, the scenery beautiful, and for a few hours I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. But when I returned to the cabin that evening, I found the diary lying open on the table. I was sure I'd left it closed. The open page was near the end. The entry was dated October 28, 1972. He's getting bolder. I hear him moving under the floor at night. Last night he whispered my name. I don't know how he knows it. If anyone finds this, leave. Don't stay the third night. That sent a shiver down my spine. I was about to shut the book when I noticed something written in pencil in the margin. It was lighter and fresher than the faded ink. The scrawl read, "I can still see you." I slammed the diary shut and backed away from the table. I hadn't written that. I spent the second night in a state of nervous dread. I locked the door, even shoved a chair under the handle. I left the light on and sat up with my back to the wall, staring at the floorboards. Around midnight, the wind died down, and the forest outside grew unnervingly silent. That's when I heard it, a faint scratching from beneath the floor. Slow, deliberate. Like fingernails against the wood, I called out, trying to convince myself it was an animal. "Who's there?" The scratching stopped. Then, from directly beneath the bed came 3 soft knocks. I don't think I've ever moved so fast. I grabbed my bag, yanked the chair away from the door, and bolted outside into the cold. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked down the dirt road by the ranger station. In the morning, I returned only long enough to grab the rest of my things. The diary was gone. I never told the rental company what happened. I didn't want to sound insane. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about that note in the margin, the one that hadn't been there the first time I read the diary. I can still see you. And sometimes when I wake in the dark, I swear I hear faint scratching beneath the floor. I'm not sure how to begin this. Part of me still thinks that writing it down will make it feel too real. Like admitting it out loud gives it power, but I need to tell someone what happened at that cabin. If you ever decide to rent a place deep in the woods, especially one that comes with its own security cameras, you might want to think twice. It started as a simple winter getaway. My friend Jenna and I booked a small cabin by a frozen lake in northern Vermont. We both work long hours in the city and wanted a quiet week with no neighbors, no traffic, just a fireplace and snow. The online listing showed a cozy wooden cabin with a wraparound deck and a little dock leading out over the lake. It also mentioned complimentary exterior security cameras for your peace of mind, which I thought was a nice touch. The first night there was perfect. We lit a fire, unpacked groceries, and drank hot cider while the wind rattled the trees outside. It was so still and quiet that every sound, the crackle of the fire, the shifting of snow on the roof, felt amplified. I went to bed thinking it was going to be the most peaceful vacation I'd ever had. The next morning, while making coffee, I noticed a small tablet sitting on the kitchen counter. It had a cracked case and a post-it note that said "Cam feed." I tapped the screen and saw a live feed of the deck outside, another camera facing the dock, and one pointed at the gravel driveway. Nothing unusual, just piles of snow and gray sky. Still, I thought it was cool to be able to check outside without opening the door. That evening, the wind picked up and a storm rolled in. By nightfall, the lake was shrouded in drifting snow. Jenna went to bed early with a book. I stayed up in the living room, half dozing in front of the fireplace. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping, like something brushing against the glass doors that opened onto the deck. I figured it was snow being blown around, but I remembered the cameras and grabbed the tablet. When I tapped the screen awake, the feed from the deck camera made me sit up straighter. On the deck, just outside the glass doors, were 4 dark shapes. They weren't people, and at least not quite. They were like silhouettes, flat and featureless, as if someone had cut them out of black paper and stood them up in the snow. They weren't moving. They weren't even facing the camera directly. They just stood there, half-turned, like they were listening for something. I got up and went to the doors. There was nothing there. The deck was empty except for a thin layer of snow blowing in the wind. My heart thudded in my ears as I turned back to the tablet. The shapes were still there on the feed. I stared at the screen for what felt like minutes, trying to understand what I was seeing. I even waved my hand in front of the glass. My arm passed through the spot where one of the shadows should have been. Finally, I shut off the tablet and told myself it was a glitch, some kind of frozen image or artifact from the storm. I went to bed without telling Jenna. The next morning, I checked the tablet again in daylight. The deck was clear. There were no shadows, no figures. I laughed it off and told myself I'd been overtired. But that night, at exactly midnight, I woke up without knowing why. The cabin was silent. I reached for the tablet on the nightstand. My stomach turned cold when I saw the feed. This time, there were 6 shadows on the deck. They stood in a loose half-circle facing the door, their outlines sharp even though there was no moonlight. They didn't sway in the wind or shift at all. They were utterly still, like cutouts pressed against the night. I sat there in bed watching the screen, barely breathing. After about 10 minutes, the feed flickered, and the deck was empty again. The next morning, I told Jenna. She laughed nervously and suggested it was a camera malfunction. We checked the deck in daylight, even walked out there and stomped in the snow to see if anything changed on the feed. Nothing. That evening, we decided to stay up together until midnight, just to prove it was nothing. We sat on the couch with the tablet propped up between us, the fire dying down to embers. The snow outside had stopped, and the night was so dark that the glass doors reflected the room like a mirror. When the clock on my phone hit 12 cow, the tablet feed shimmered, and there they were. 7 shadows this time, lined up along the railing. They were facing the camera now. Even though they had no faces, I had the terrible sense they were staring right at us. Jenna whispered, "It's a glitch." "It has to be." I shook my head. "Then why are there more every night?" Neither of us could bring ourselves to look out the glass doors. We sat frozen, watching the feed as the figures stood there. After a while, Jenna reached out and turned off the tablet. We sat in silence until the fire burned out completely. The following day, we tried calling the rental office, but the number went straight to voicemail. We left a message about the cameras acting strange. No one called back. We thought about leaving, but a heavy snowfall had blocked the road the night before. The ranger station wouldn't be able to clear it for another day. That night, we agreed not to check the tablet. We tried to distract ourselves with a movie on my laptop, keeping the lights on, but the atmosphere in the cabin felt heavy, like the air itself was listening. Around midnight, we heard a faint creaking on the porch, the sound of wood shifting under weight. Neither of us moved. We didn't look at the tablet. The next morning, I found wet footprints on the deck just outside the doors. They were shaped like human feet, but narrower, longer, as if someone had pressed a hand into the snow over and over to make a path. They led from the railing to the door and then stopped. We packed our bags, determined to leave as soon as the ranger cleared the road. By afternoon, we finally got a call saying the path was open. We didn't wait for another night. As we loaded the car, I glanced up at the cabin one last time. From the driveway, you could see the deck clearly. The snow on the boards looked untouched except for our own boot prints. But as we pulled away, I had the distinct feeling that if I'd checked the tablet right then, it would have shown them, lined up and watching us leave. That was 3 months ago. Back home in the city, I tried to convince myself it was all some trick of bad weather and old cameras. But sometimes, when I wake up around midnight, I swear I see faint shapes at the far end of my apartment balcony, standing still in the dark. I've stopped checking. I still own that cabin in Tahoe, but I haven't set foot inside it in over 3 years. I tell myself I'll sell it eventually, that I'll finally put the place behind me. But every time I get close, the memories start creeping in. The late night calls, the static, that voice. I can't even drive past the forest road that leads there anymore. I bought the cabin in the spring of 2019. It was an impulsive decision after my divorce and a way to get out of the city and start fresh. The cabin sat at the edge of the forest, a good 20-minute drive from the nearest neighbor. I thought I wanted peace and solitude. I thought a place like that would heal me. I didn't realize how easily solitude could turn on you. It started on my second night there. I had just finished unpacking, sitting on the couch with a beer, listening to the wind outside. The cabin had a landline phone because cell service was spotty that deep in the woods. Around 11:30 p.m., the phone rang. The sound of it startled me. It had that old-fashioned metallic ring, the kind you don't hear much anymore. I picked it up expecting maybe a wrong number or a neighbor checking in. There was no one there. Just a faint hiss of static like a distant ocean. I said hello a few times, but the line stayed open. Nothing but that whispery static. Eventually I hung up, figuring it was either a bad connection or maybe a telemarketer's robocall glitching out. I didn't think much of it until the next night. Same time, same metallic ring, same empty static. By the fourth night, the calls started coming at 11:37 on the dot. That precision was what unsettled me. It wasn't random. I stopped answering after the third night, but the phone would keep ringing until it went to that old landline busy tone. I started leaving the phone off the hook so it wouldn't ring, but that didn't work either. I'd wake up to find it back on the cradle, as if someone had quietly replaced it in the middle of the night. By the end of the first week, I was jumpy all the time. The cabin, which had felt cozy at first, began to feel too small, too dark. The forest outside the windows loomed like a wall of blackness. One night, I worked up the nerve to answer the call again. I told myself I'd listen carefully, maybe catch some clue, a background sound, a voice. I waited until 11:37, sat by the phone, and picked up on the first ring. At first, it was just the same static. Then faintly underneath it, I heard something. I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, a soft, deliberate sound like someone breathing. I said hello. I asked who it was. No response. The breathing went on, slow and steady. I don't know why I didn't hang up right then. I stayed on the line, heart pounding. Finally, after what felt like a full minute, a voice spoke. It was a whisper, hoarse, almost as if the person's mouth was dry. The word was so faint I wasn't sure I heard it right. Outside. That single word sent a jolt through me. I slammed the phone down and locked every door and window in the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the phone company. The woman I spoke to sounded confused when I gave her the number that had been showing up on the caller ID, a string of zeros. She told me that wasn't a valid number, that it couldn't be making calls. That afternoon, I drove down to the nearest hardware store and bought heavier locks and a battery-powered motion sensor light for the porch. But the calls kept coming. Every night. Always at 11:37. Sometimes it was just static. Sometimes the whispering. Once I heard what sounded like soft laughter, slow and breathy, as though whoever it was wanted me to know they were there, and enjoying my fear. The worst night was in late October. It was cold, the kind of cold that makes the trees creak. I had the fireplace going, trying to pretend everything was normal when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but something in me snapped. I grabbed the receiver and shouted into it. The whisper came back immediately, as if the person had been waiting. "Look outside." I froze. I don't know why I did it, but I turned my head toward the big front window. There, just at the edge of the tree line where the porch light barely reached, was a figure. Tall. Still. Completely motionless. I couldn't make out its face, only that it was standing in the dark among the trees as if it had been there the whole time. I dropped the phone. When I looked back toward the window a few seconds later, the figure was gone. I called the sheriff's office that night. A deputy came out the next day, a guy in his 40s with a patient, skeptical smile. He looked around the cabin, checked the phone line, and walked the edge of the woods. He didn't find any footprints. He told me it was probably some kids messing with me, maybe using a spoofed number. He gave me his card and left. That night, the phone didn't ring. I thought maybe it was finally over. But the following night at 11:37, the phone rang again. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just sat there on the couch staring at the phone as it rang and rang. When it finally stopped, the silence felt worse somehow. I barely slept. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on the window. Not a knock. A light, deliberate tap like a fingernail against the glass. I couldn't bring myself to look. I just lay there, eyes wide open in the dark, clutching the blanket like it would protect me. I left the cabin the next morning. Packed a bag, locked the door, and drove straight back to the city. For weeks, I refused to go back. I rented a small apartment and tried to forget about the cabin. Then about a month later, I got a call on my cell phone. No caller ID. I answered before I could think. All I heard was that same faint static, and then the whisper, hoarse and dry, "Come back." I hung up and blocked the number, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. I've only returned to the cabin twice since then, both times during the day, both times quick trips to check the property. The phone is still there, unplugged. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I plugged it back in. I tell myself I never will. But at night, when I'm lying awake in the city far from Tahoe, I sometimes think I hear it, that old metallic ring, coming faintly from the shadows of my apartment, and I wonder if the calls ever really stopped. I don't think I'll ever go camping again. Even writing this down makes my chest tighten, like the darkness itself is leaning in to listen. I'm sharing this because I can't stop thinking about it, and maybe getting it out will help. Or maybe I just want someone else to know what's out there. We'd rented an old wooden cabin in the mountains for a long weekend. Me, my girlfriend Jenna, my best friend Eric, and his younger sister Claire. It was late October, the kind of crisp, dry autumn where the nights come early and the forest smells like cold earth and pine needles. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, which was the whole point. We wanted a weekend of hiking and being unplugged. The first night was uneventful. We made our own fire in the cabin's old stone pit, roasted marshmallows and told dumb ghost stories under a sky thick with stars. The mountains were quiet except for the occasional breeze that stirred the pines. When we went to bed, I remember thinking how peaceful it felt out there. It was the second night when we saw the lights. We'd gone for a hike late in the afternoon and didn't get back until dusk. The trail behind the cabin wound down a hill and crossed a small stream before disappearing deeper into the forest. While the others started dinner, I stepped outside to bring in more firewood. That's when I noticed it. A faint orange glow way down the trail through the trees. It looked like a campfire. At first, I thought nothing of it. This was a national forest after all. But the more I watched, the more it bothered me. The glow didn't flicker like a normal fire. It was steady, like a lantern or a candle flame held perfectly still. I called Jenna outside. She squinted into the trees and said she saw it too. When we told Eric, he grinned and said, "Some other hikers are out there." Big deal, but Claire frowned. "There aren't any campsites down that way," she said. She'd looked at the trail map earlier that day. "It just keeps going into the woods." We ate dinner and forgot about it for a while. Later, as night deepened, we noticed the glow again through the living room window. Only this time it looked closer, maybe a few hundred yards from the cabin. Eric laughed it off, but I felt a twist in my stomach. I can't explain why. Something about the way the light hovered between the trees felt wrong, like it was watching us. That's when Eric suggested we check it out. "It's probably just some campers," he said. "Could be fun to say hi." Claire was against it, but Jenna said she was curious too, so I agreed. We grabbed our flashlights and headed down the trail. The forest was different at night. The air felt colder, and the shadows of the pines stretched like black pillars across the narrow path. We didn't talk much, just listened to the crunch of our boots on the leaves. Every few minutes we'd stop and scan ahead for the glow. It was always there until we got close. We'd walk toward it for what felt like 10 or 15 minutes, watching it flicker between the tree trunks. But as soon as we reached the spot where we thought it should be, there was nothing. Just darkness and the smell of damp moss. Then when we turned back toward the cabin, we'd see the glow again, behind us farther off, as if it had retreated. That first night we gave up after an hour. We went back to the cabin uneasy but trying to laugh it off. Eric said we must have been seeing some distant lantern, or even headlights from a car on a distant ridge. None of us believed it, but we didn't argue. The third night was worse. It started around 8 p.m. Jenna saw the glow first, standing at the kitchen window. "It's back," she whispered. I joined her and saw not one light this time, but three. 3 distinct orange glows lined up in the distance like a row of campfires. I can't describe the dread that sank into me then. There was no good reason to be afraid, yet I was. Maybe it was because the woods were silent. No crickets, no owls, not even the breeze through the branches. Just a deep, unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Eric grabbed his jacket and said, "Come on, let's finally see what this is." I hesitated but didn't want to look like a coward, so I went along. Claire flat out refused to leave the cabin. "You're idiots," she said. "Something's not right about those fires." We left her behind and set off with flashlights. I remember the way the beams cut through the darkness in thin white cones, the way the light caught tiny drifting specks of mist. The 3 orange glows seemed closer than ever, only a short hike down the trail. But as before, the closer we got, the farther they seemed. Sometimes they winked out altogether, only to reappear off to one side or behind a stand of trees. It was like the forest was playing tricks on us. After maybe half an hour, Eric stopped. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I listened. At first I heard nothing. Then a faint sound drifted through the woods, low and rhythmic, almost like humming. It rose and fell in a pattern that didn't sound like any song I knew. I felt the hair on my arm stand up. Jenna grabbed my arm. "We should go back," Eric shook his head. "It's just people, maybe singing around their campfires." But there was something off about the sound. It wasn't coming from one direction, but seemed to move around us, weaving through the trees like smoke. We kept going for another 10 minutes, drawn forward more by a strange compulsion than curiosity. The glow always stayed just ahead, never letting us reach it. Eventually we came to the stream, the same one we'd crossed in daylight, but now the water barely trickled under a thin skin of ice. On the far side between the pines I saw the lights again, only this time they weren't steady. They bobbed slightly as if someone or something was carrying them. That's when Jenna broke. She turned and started back toward the cabin, saying, I'm done. I followed her, and after a moment Eric came too, though he kept glancing over his shoulder. The whole walk back we felt like we were being watched. Once I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees, tall and narrow, but when I shone my flashlight there was nothing but bark and shadow. When we got back to the cabin, Claire was pale and shaking. She said she'd seen the lights too, moving outside the kitchen window, circling the cabin like fireflies too large and too bright. We locked the doors and tried to convince ourselves we were safe. We didn't build a fire in the pit that night. We stayed inside, huddled in the living room with all the lights on, but the forest outside stayed pitch black. I don't think any of us slept. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a faint orange glow slipping through the gap in the curtains. My first thought was sunrise, but it was too early and the color was wrong. I crept to the window and looked out. There were dozens of them, dozens of orange lights scattered across the clearing in front of the cabin. They weren't campfires. They floated a few feet above the ground, swaying slightly like lanterns carried by invisible hands. I couldn't see any figures holding them, just the lights themselves. I didn't wake the others. I couldn't move. I just stood there frozen, watching as the lights slowly drifted closer. Then, as if they sensed I was watching, they stopped. The humming sound returned, so faint I could feel it more in my bones than hear it in my ears. I don't know how long I stood there staring before the glow began to fade one by one, until the clearing was empty and dark again. We left at first light. None of us talked much on the drive home. Eric tried to joke about it once or twice, but even he couldn't laugh. Claire just stared out the window the whole time. Jenna held my hand so tightly her nails left marks in my skin. A week later, I went online and searched for reports of strange lights in that forest. I found a few old posts on obscure forums, people describing campfire-like glows that disappeared when approached, soft humming in the woods, lights that followed hikers back to their cabins. None of the posts had any real answers, just warnings we haven't gone back. We don't talk about it much either, but sometimes at night I'll catch Jenna staring out the window, as if she's waiting to see a faint orange flicker between the trees. And sometimes, though I tell myself it's just a trick of my eyes, I think I see it too. I need to get this off my chest because ever since that trip I haven't been able to sleep properly. I keep telling myself there has to be a rational explanation, but the more I think about it, the less that seems possible. Maybe writing it down will help me convince myself that I didn't just imagine it. Last fall, my girlfriend Jenna and I rented a small cabin in northern Vermont for a weekend getaway. It wasn't one of those glossy vacation rentals you see in magazines. It was an old A-frame tucked deep in the woods about a mile down a dirt road from the nearest paved street. The listing said it had been built in 1987, but it looked older. Pine walls with faded varnish, a stone fireplace, a couple of rocking chairs that creaked if you even looked at them. The first night there was nothing unusual. We arrived late in the afternoon, lit a fire, made some pasta, and flipped through a few of the board games stacked in the living room. I remember noticing a guest book on the shelf next to the Monopoly box, a big leather-bound journal with yellowed pages, but I didn't open it. The next morning, while Jenna was making coffee, I picked it up. I always like seeing little notes from past visitors. Sometimes they mention good hiking spots or warn you about things like tricky driveway turns. The first few pages were exactly what you'd expect. Short messages in different handwriting, often with a little drawing or a smiley face. But as I flipped further back, I noticed a name that showed up again and again: Daniel Price. The handwriting was identical each time. The dates, though, were what got me. The most recent entry from Daniel was from July 2022. Nothing strange there. But the next time I saw his name was on a page from 2016. Same name, same handwriting, a slightly crooked cursive P, then 2009, then 1999, then 1991. I kept flipping and found more. The earliest one was dated October 1963. The cabin wasn't built until 1987. That fact kept knocking around in my head. I checked the outside cover to make sure it was the same book the whole time, not a collection of older journals glued together. It was the same thick journal, the same yellowing pages, no seams or extra bindings. What unsettled me more than the dates were the entries themselves. They were all eerily similar. The woods are quiet tonight. I'll be back soon. Daniel Price. Sometimes the wording changed. The air is clear tonight. I'll return. Or the cabin waits. But it always had that same strange tone, and it never mentioned the season, the weather, or anything that might have dated it. Jenna laughed when I showed her. She said it was probably some local prank, a caretaker keeping up a joke for decades. I tried to laugh too, but there was something about the handwriting that didn't feel playful. It was too precise, too careful. That night the wind picked up. We could hear it pushing against the walls, making the cabin creak. Around 2 a.m. I woke up to what I thought was the sound of the front door closing. Jenna was still asleep beside me. I lay there in the dark, listening until I convinced myself it was just the wind. The next morning I went to get firewood from the stack outside. On the porch railing right beside the front door, there was a faint smudge that looked like a wet handprint. It was small, maybe the size of my palm, and it hadn't been there the day before. I mentioned it to Jenna, but she brushed it off. We went hiking most of the day and got back just before dusk. The woods around the cabin felt off. I don't know how else to say it. You know when a place feels like it's watching you? That evening, as we were playing cards by the fire, I noticed the guest book wasn't where I'd left it. I thought maybe Jenna had moved it when she was cleaning up, but she swore she hadn't touched it. We eventually found it on the porch, leaning against the wall near the door. I brought it inside and flipped through it again. This time there was a fresh entry on the last page. The woods are quiet tonight. I'm almost home. Daniel Price, September 23rd, 2024. That was the exact date. Neither of us wrote it. We hadn't left the cabin since the morning hike. The door had been locked all day. We barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin set us on edge. At some point past midnight, I heard footsteps outside on the porch. Slow, measured, crunching softly on the wood. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but the steps were too deliberate. Then there was a soft knock on the door. Just 2 taps, and then silence. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. After a few minutes, I finally worked up the nerve to peer through the window next to the door. The porch was empty. We left at dawn. We didn't even stop for breakfast. As we were packing the car, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The guest book was gone. It had been on the coffee table when we went to bed. I searched for it quickly but couldn't find it anywhere. We drove the whole way back to Boston without saying much. Neither of us wanted to talk about what had happened. A week later, out of morbid curiosity, I checked the cabin's online listing again. It was still up. Same photos, same description. I scrolled through the recent reviews, expecting someone to mention the weird guest book. Instead, the latest review, posted just a few days after we left, caught my attention. It was from a couple named Mark and Hannah. They wrote, "We love the cabin. Cozy and peaceful. The guest book is such a nice touch." We saw all the past visitors' notes. Funny how the first entry goes all the way back to 1963. Whoever Daniel Price is, he must really love this place. I stared at the screen for a long time. I've thought about calling the cabin's owner, but I don't know what I'd even say. Hi, I think there's a ghost writing in your guest book. It's been months now. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint, deliberate knocks, 2 soft taps on my apartment door. There's never anyone there when I check. I keep telling myself it's just my imagination, that the whole thing was some weird prank. But last night, when I came home from work, there was a padded envelope waiting on my doorstep. No return address. Inside was the guest book. It was open to a fresh page. The city is quiet tonight. I'm almost there. Daniel Price, February 12th, 2025.